Hello and welcome to Masters with Masters. I'm Ed Hoffman, the NASA Chief Knowledge Officer, and I'm here at the Glenn Research Center. These sessions bring together two distinguished practitioners with a lot of experience who share a lot of their lessons and stories pertaining to working at NASA and the missions that we have going on here. Today we're fortunate to have Diane Malarik, who is the Senior Project Manager in the Space Flight Systems Directorate, and is also the Glenn Research Center point of contact for the Advanced Exploration Systems Program within Human Explorations and Operations. She's also been responsible for a successful execution of a portfolio of over a dozen different technology demonstration projects that help us to enable technologies for the enhancement of human exploration. Welcome, Diane.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
And we also have Michael Barrett, who is with us, who is the Deputy Chief for the Space Technology Project Office at Glenn. He's the Acting Project Manager for SEP, which is the Solar Electric Propulsion Project. And he's also the Module Manager for the Asteroid Redirect Robotics Mission, led by JPL for NASA Human Exploration. And also welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Ed.
Both of you have had long careers, and we've been talking, you've been working with each other for quite a while. And so as a starting point, how did you get to this point in your career where you're working key missions for the agency, and what were some of the key decision points in your career? I'll start with you, Diane.
Well, I kind of fell into NASA. It was not a planned career at all. In fact, the whole 25 years, none of it has ever been planned. So I started out in research, and our job was in polymers to create new materials, and I don't know if you know this, but it is very hard to invent a new material, and I found I wasn't particularly good at it. So when there were opportunities to move into this new division called Space Experiments Division, they were looking for project managers and deputy project managers. I moved at that time. So I was the ripe old age of 27 years old, a deputy project manager, and when I got there, I'm like, oh, I think I could do this, you know. So
this being the management part.
Management, yes, okay. Because those who can do and those who can't manage, you know. That's
okay.
That's okay.
We'll cut that out.
Really?
So actually, one of the things you were mentioning before, you said you were good at saying yes to the different opportunities.
I am. So from then on, anytime a manager came to me and said, would you do this? Would you take on this new responsibility? I said yes. I figured they knew more than I did, and that if they think I should do the job, then I should just say yes. And so my entire career, I have just said yes, and more projects have come my way, and bigger and more complex, and so it's been a good choice of mine just to say yes.
Okay, so we'll follow. And so Michael, I guess same question for you. What got you to this point and involved in running key programs and space technology?
So we can keep a running count, but this will be the first time I say Diane and I are very different for this.
Have you always said no?
Some people might say that's the case, but no, I was a energetic, naive undergraduate in aeronautical and astronautical engineering at Purdue, and all I wanted to do was work for NASA. And so I started at the Johnson Space Center working on shuttle systems, shuttle main propulsion. I came into the agency at a wonderful time because 1989, there were still a ton of core folks at JSC who had worked on Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, right? They were there and they were eager to help bring up some of the new crop. And plus it was a time we had just come off Challenger, and so there was real money to do things for design improvement and safety enhancement for shuttle, right? So coming in as a fresh engineer where there was money to be spent on hardware development and make changes with lots of knowledge, it was terrific. So I worked 20 shuttle flights there, then did some time in the test facility, ended up in one of the design groups. After I left JSC, I went to academia for about 5 years, and then I missed the large engineering systems, right, that we can only do at NASA. And so I came to Glenn 2003, worked on some of the nuclear systems area, and then here at the center, I started in research after I'd finished my graduate degrees, but then I quickly found out that even in research I was doing project management. I went over, did some project management. I ended up in engineering, but back in project management here at Glenn. in general, I would say when someone came to me and said, hey, we have a really hard problem and we'd like you to do it, I'm a sucker for that entrance line. So those were the yeses, right? The no's tended to be more on the, that looks pretty routine, you know, kind of thing. But yeah, if it looked like it was a challenge that couldn't be done, that always would spark me. So.
Right. So complex challenges, difficulties, things that you could think both, I guess, management as well as an engineering, you know, aspect in it. And what about early mentors or people who have made a difference? I mean, have you had folks in terms of your career, Diane?
Well, I have. My first project manager, I was 27 years old, and I'm the deputy project manager of a team of 20 people, all of whom are older than me and more experienced. And my project manager was probably 25 years older than me, and we shared an office.
What was the name of the?
Ed Winza.
Okay.
And he's since retired, and it was just a really great project, and I learned a lot from him just by watching him, how he treated people, and that was important. And he let me do really anything. And we shared this office, and he would tell me, he said, I'm going to let you do your job, how you want to do. He made me the chief scheduler. I was the integration engineer. It was back in the day when, you know, people really, the deputy or project managers were everything, did everything all at once. And so he said, I'm going to let you do your job, and every once in a while, I'm just going to nudge you just a little. And so I can remember just, you know, one time him saying, I was on the phone and I agreed to something, and I hung up, and he's like, yeah, that was a bad idea. You got to call, and he would explain why, and I'm like, oh, okay, let me call them back, you know, but for the most part, he let me figure it out on my own, and he really believed that the team was the important part, and they are, and we're just the face at the top, you know, the project management, but it's really the team that does all the hard and the heavy lifting. Right.
And so some of the key qualities, they gave you a lot of autonomy and room,
yeah,
but also occasional
a little bit
guidance
of
of what you're doing well and,
yeah,
and how to make it work. What about you, Michael?
Yeah, that's very similar. I didn't have a lot of formal mentoring, right? The way we look at it now in terms of programs and oh, you're the mentor, you're the mentee.
That's because we're old.
It is.
And they didn't have mentoring programs when we started.
I wasn't going to say it that way, but you're right. Yes.
And 89.
It's true. It's true, right? But you still form those relationships.
Yeah.
And for me, they were also either in the project functional chain or in the management chain. When I first started at JSC, Henry Pohl was the director of engineering. And Henry would sit around, we would sit in the mission evaluation room, and he would tell stories about when he worked with von Braun, right? And it was great. You know, I mean, I soaked it up. But so he would do that, and he would have his opinions and give you ideas about career advice. But his main thing was, go do something that's interesting. You know, something that looks like no one's done, and you know, just go try it and see what it's there. So he was a huge factor. Hugh Brasso was my first branch chief at NASA. I don't know that I ever had a better one. He just encouraged folks to try lots of different stuff, right? So within our division, not all the branch chiefs encouraged it, but he was, I want you to try to get through all the branches in the division, right, in your first 4 years here. You know, to try to move around, get exposed to what we did. Those were terrific. I actually also had a graduate professor that was a huge influence in terms of my approach to the engineering side of things. He would talk about there are really only 5 fundamental principles in any kind of engineering. So yeah, you graduated as an aeronautical engineer, right, but now you're studying for mechanical engineering. That doesn't mean that the same principles aren't in electrical engineering and chemical engineering. So branch out. You know, it's just because someone else is a discipline expert, don't be afraid of learning about their subsystem, because basically if you get the fundamentals, you can see how it integrates. But in all of those cases, I agree. They let me do my job, right? They would come in and say, this is your job. You try to go out and figure out how to do it. And they would let me fail. Little failures, right? If it was something that was going to be really bad, I could think of a couple instances, same thing, where it's like they let me get into it initially, where I got far enough in to see this might be an issue, and then they would come in and go, okay, yeah, this is an issue, and here's some options, you know, how to look at it. But that feeling of, we're going to tell you what you need to do and let you experiment, imprinted on me early, And so you get into different situations later in your career where you don't have that kind of freedom, and it's frustrating, right? So when it's great to have that experience up front, but you also have to kind of gauge yourself later. To go, not everyone's like that. Different people have different management styles, and learning to work your way through those are good challenges as well. So.
It sounds like, so both of you had, sounds like you had multiple, different informal mentors.
Yeah.
And I would even, I think nowadays, I usually think informal ones probably work best because people are coming together around different things. But it sounds like one of the mentors you had was really geared towards giving you, encouraging you to take on different assignments and to trust yourself in terms of autonomy. And then you had others, it sounds like, who were geared towards the technical discipline of, here are some lessons. Do you still have different kinds of mentors, or have you seen more of a sequential where it's one person at a time?
I find that every time I work with someone new, closely, I learn something from them. We worked with Ann over, I was her deputy, and on Connect, and she was a project manager. And I learned an enormous amount from her, and I had been a project manager for 20 years by that time. And just, so every time you work with or for somebody, you pick up something new on organization or communication or, just different techniques that expand your toolbox.
Right. And you work together, I think, on Connect. And that's what you, and so I'll come back to maybe seeing what are some of the lessons how did you learn from each other? But, let me go back to you, Michael. Any thoughts in terms of that? How do you choose a mentor, if someone's wondering about that?
So I do think that the formal programs we have are important, and where you try to have folks that are willing to be mentored. In fact, that's probably the biggest advantage, I think, because the folks that are saying, yes, I'd like to be a mentor, they're prepared and they're going to commit their time. That's terrific. Choosing a mentor, in the informal cases, I think it just happens, right? People with natural similar interests kind of merge together. So in the formal programs, I'd say look for that. Look for, even if it's something small in the background where it's like, hey, that seems interesting to me. I'd like to know more about it. For me, in those interactions, not so much an engineering or project management or discipline-specific thing. It was more someone that helped me see the next level up, right? So like if I was a subsystem engineer, somebody could help me see the system, or someone that could help me see the component. Either way, right, was terrific. And that's not just on the technical side. That's the institutional side, that's the political side, that's the project side, but somebody either way that could show me a level up or a level down better, which is why it's not always someone that is more senior even, right? It's somebody with experience at a different area.
Right. See the larger system, different aspects of it.
Or how that smaller component is being affected by what we're doing in the larger system. So.
Yeah. What about, both of you have worked cross-center issues and with other agencies and partners. Have you also had mentors from other locations, and how easy is that to do? Or less so?
I wouldn't say really it was more mentoring, but it does show you a different way to do things. Clearly, other centers operate in different ways, and just their culture or their mores. It brings a diversity of thought that is always better than just one person's way of doing it or one institution. So I had the pleasure of working with JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, and they do things very differently than we do. Absolute top-notch engineering. They know their stuff, but they do things differently, and so that's a challenge for us.
Is there anything you brought back that you said, "Wow, I'd like us to do something here. I'm going to bring that back"? Or
well, I found they were very non-committal. They would not commit to something they weren't positive they could do. They wouldn't be forced into a box, and they would take your concerns. And they said, well, we will coordinate. I heard that. I can't tell you how many. Yes, we will. And they will coordinate with their folks back home. And so I think I've learned to, not commit too soon. Leave things a little more open until it gels up enough that you feel, confident in making that commitment. And don't let management here push you to commit to something that you're really not sure you can do.
And they knew our documentation better than we did.
Yeah, they were good.
Yeah.
They were good.
They were really good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cross center-wise, I'm not sure that they would identify it as a mentor relationship, but I worked on a project with JPL early on when I was at Glenn. That John Cassani was the project manager and Duncan McPherson was the lead system engineer. And just being able to watch those two work a project through early formulation and through early implementation was terrific. And they also, it was the same thing, right? So, you know, after the meeting breaks up and you're sitting around the hallway, they had wonderful stories of, yeah, remember the time, right, when we were on our 6th launch vehicle that we were going to use, right, for this flight. And so I learned a lot from them. It's the same thing. It's the exposure and their perspective of working with us. Right? So whenever I encounter somebody at another agency or another center that either has worked with NASA before or has worked with Glenn specifically before, I love to hear, what'd you think? Because that gives me some insight into where we're going, right? Because that's the construct that they've got. So again, not formal situations, but the previous experience and here's ways that we can work moving forward based on past experience was really helpful.
And you're working now Asteroid Redirect robotics mission, which is with JPL.
JPL again as well.
And so does that mentoring with a Cassani or with some of the others that you meant, does that add to your kind of, I don't know, toolkit, but your knowledge of the location and context?
Absolutely,
okay.
right. So we've got half a dozen folks on the current JPL and Glenn teams that also worked on Prometheus and Gemmo back, that was the mission I was referencing. And so we came in with a construct of, we've done this before and we've worked well together before. And so I think part of it is just the experience enables you to have that upfront, very frank discussion of, there's some bad things in the history and there's some good things in the history, and let's try to make sure that we're focusing on these. How do we recreate the good things?
So you could be honest.
Yeah,
with each
it does
other.
help. Yeah.
Right. I guess I'm wondering, you had mentioned, we were talking before we started, and we do have an audience here, and so we'll have some questions, and folks who I understand have worked with you on Connect, perhaps other projects. Can you talk about working together, and what are some of the things you've learned from each other? And what did you learn as part of working? You mentioned, I think Ann Over was one of the informal mentors, and you said it was a good learning experience. What were some of the key things you walked away in terms of lessons?
Really, that a team that pulls together can do anything. It really, if you get the right people in the right spot, it's amazing what a team can do. And so it was such a positive experience for me. It was, no question, the hardest job I ever had, and no question the most rewarding. And I, couldn't be happier that I have
Because
that
of
on
the
my
team.
resume. Yeah, and
Yeah.
we had so many problems on Connect that you would see it all. So if you came, every possible, it felt like, every possible problem that could ever come up, technically, programmatically, it did. And this team just beat every one of them down. It was like playing whack-a-mole. And I remember, like, Monday would be, okay, one problem Monday, and another one Tuesday, and 3 on, Wednesday. And then somehow they would just start ticking them off.
Yeah.
And by Friday, we're like, we're in pretty good shape here, I think. So I think if people believe and your management supports you, and the Glenn Research Center got behind us.
Yeah.
And so I have publicly thanked not only our team members, but also the people not on our team that got short shrift because we had a problem. And, we pulled in unique expertise or slid in the fab shop in front of people or whatever. So you can do anything.
I'm going to come back because you piqued my interest when you said that you experience every kind of problem. So I want to come back and say, what was the biggest problem that had you to overcome that? But let me give you the chance to think about that, and I go to Michael. So what did you learn from that experience, and how did you, again, take that to where you are today?
Yeah, so Connect definitely was about the team, right? But I do also just have to say, Ann Over for Connect was the perfect project manager, right? So it was a crazy hard challenge. So in some ways, we had these conversations, it was safe. No one expected us to succeed, right? So it was, please save this before it dies. And so that's, in some ways, a good situation to be in. But Ann came in, and so I was the chief engineer on the project. And I mean, it must have been 6 weeks in. Ann and I came in at about the same time. And I walked into her office and I said, I can't keep up with you on the details. I can't. So Ann is tenacious and has a crazy good memory about all of the technical details. And the reason I mention that is that every now and then you'll encounter somebody that says, well, the project manager doesn't need to understand the details. True, right? We can't understand all of it. But I'll tell you, as much as you can understand is a helpful thing to have to enable you to better manage the project. So to pretend like it's not worth trying to understand the details is a falsehood, right? And Ann was just excelled at that. But the thing I took away from there were tons of things I learned from all the different folks on the team. But the big picture thing, walking away from it and look at it, we had the right team. I mean, that doesn't always happen either. And so granted, it was a special situation that we're trying to save this. It got center priority. And we pulled a couple of folks from other areas. But the overall team makeup in terms of diversity, right? Ways people approach problems, balance between folks, right? So Ann was tenacious and Diane was a little laid back, right? And say, well, let's talk about what this means in the big picture kind of thing. And I like to think that I was the chief engineer, Josh Free was my deputy for a long time. I actually had a couple others with Janice as well. But we balanced, right? So I tended to be kind of heavy and assertive on stuff in terms of, I know I need this and this and this, and Josh would be, okay, we'll calm down. Our lead system engineer, Todd Toffel, he's as steady as they come, right? Nothing would upset Todd. And put all of those different dynamics for the team, regardless of the challenge and the problem, it was just the right folks with the right natural tendencies on how to get the work done that helped keep the team balanced. I value that enormously. And so it's not easy to put the right team together, but if you can, up front, oh my gosh, it makes the job easier. So, I mean, that was my big picture takeaway from Connect.
Yeah. Sounds like, so you had a team, you were able to create a team that had a diversity of skills and disciplines, but also personalities.
Personalities,
So it was able to link that way.
Who's comfortable taking risk? You need to balance that with someone who's not comfortable taking risk. Right. And there's that healthy tension all the time when you need to make a decision. And of course, you have to make it with imperfect knowledge. Nobody has enough time to run all the tests and do all the analysis you'd like. So you have to count on these individuals representing their areas and what their role is. And you need everybody, to chime in. And I say when nobody is completely happy, everyone's mostly happy. Yeah. That's the right place. That's
also, sounds like you must have had, because it sounds like a situation where if people see things different ways, they're also bringing conflict in. But you must have had an effective leadership or an effective team that can deal effectively with the conflict to get to.
I think that ultimately the team believed in us. As it was a management team of chief engineer, SE&I lead, the project management team, that they believed in us, I think, and they represented their area, everybody got their time in the say their piece, explain, and when we made a decision, I think for the most part, people were comfortable with it.
I think the two aspects I hope they felt. One was that they had the time, right, to present their opinion and give their perspective and to argue their point. And then they trusted us that we were trying to do what we thought was best for the project, right, for success, to get to success. So if it was a time where they weren't going to get their recommendation approved, it was because in the big picture we didn't think that was the right thing to do to get us successfully to the end. So I hope that they felt like they were heard and they trusted that we were trying to do what was in the best interest of the whole team.
So I'll come back to the problem question. What was perhaps one of the biggest problems you had, and how did you overcome it?
There were so many. I think the biggest problem that Connect faced was almost kind of before we really came in, is that they were not, the project was not appropriately supported by Glenn Research Center, and just didn't have the priority and just didn't have the personnel that they needed. And so dug them, Connect dug itself such a deep hole that, coming out was such an accomplishment. That's what sticks with me, is that once the right people got in place, you could do this. You could succeed. So Mike mentioned something about it was like a win-win proposition. We were all asked. I came on a couple months, maybe 2 or 3 after Mike, asked to come work this project, and I of course said yes, because I always said yes. And other people would say, I can't believe you're going to work that project. Everybody knows Connect is screwed up. Right. And I'm like, I know, this is the best thing. It's a great challenge. If it gets canceled, hey, there were 2 sets of project managers before me. It's not my fault. And if we succeed, this is all good, goodness for me. So to me, it was win-win. And I like a challenge, and I like, I'm driven by that. I do, personally like to feel like I'm making an impact, and I felt like that was, my way to make an impact. So.
It's typical of a lot of projects that I've seen at NASA, is that, so the joke goes is that if you want to be a successful project manager, be the 2nd or 3rd in. Because oftentimes the first, when a project starts, it doesn't have the pressure, it doesn't get the resourcing, it doesn't get the visibility, and maybe the support.
Right.
And then we get to the point where it has to get to that, where it has to be successful.
So where it's really behind schedule and really not enough money.
Right. Well, that's a common theme in studies I've done with, where it has to get to the point where we get behind it. Is anything you'd say about the?
So I have to agree with the fact that what I would say 2 of the biggest challenges for Connect happened before we were there. And not just the center's fault, but originally when the idea was conceived, right, the stories are, because again, we weren't there, but the stories are that someone with, I would argue, not a lot of experience said, oh yeah, we can fly a payload, external payload on station for $25 million, right, of this complexity. It was a complex system. And I would look at that and say, that's not real. And so someone suggested it and someone bought it, and that's how it was created. Now, hopefully someone will say, oh, he's not right, and that's not what really happened, and great. But that was the story. So it was this, to genericize it, this idea that someone gave an estimate for a scope of work at a certain budget and schedule, and it was fantasy. It was not going to be what happened. That was one. At the center level, it was priority and staffing. It certainly was, right? So the first project manager that I worked with, Gus Marsopoulos, right? Gus had a huge challenge, and when I went back and looked through his notes and stuff that he presented ahead of time, he knew what the issues were, right? But it was priority 5 at the center at best, right? At best. When Constellation died, it moved right up because suddenly it was, hey, here's a technology to flight project. That's what we're about, right? So.
This gets to the timing thing we were talking about.
It was absolutely timing, you bet. Once we were actually up and running and moving, it wasn't as severe a challenge, but we definitely walked right through the midst of, hey, how do you balance what 7120 and 7123 say and what we need to do to fly a Class D payload, right? Never mind that if you go through the actual documentation, an external payload on station is given as an example of a Class B. But of course, no one wanted to pay for a Class B, so, but to walk through and say, what do we have to do, right? What's prudent to give us a reasonable chance of success? And so we lived that. I mean, we walked through it in real time.
We were fortunate in project management that we had a chief engineer team that could assess all kinds of options. I mean, he talks about Anne, being so technically, amazing, and she is, but so is Mike. And he could listen to all these different suggestions of how to solve a problem. And he would actually combine them into some new solution that took the best parts of each of them and left the worst parts and the risks, and minimized the risks. And so that, was just such a huge benefit and just such a gift for project management to have, a chief engineer who's really bringing you great, fabulous solutions.
So it's good to know that she views it that way now.
So we do have some questions from the audience we have here, and it followed to, I think, where you started. And so this one's for Diane, which is, what do you feel is Mike's management strength when you started getting into?
I honestly, I think his strength is to look at all these different options and pick the best one, and it really is the best one. And it will be something that we all sat in the room and didn't occur to us, but as soon as he articulates it, we're like, yeah, that's pretty good. So I think that his ability to separate the good from the bad and make a compromise, that I think he's really good at that.
Seeing the patterns in the system and then coming up, making a decision, that's the best one.
It really.
Another question for you, for Diane, is what is Diane's greatest management strength?
Motivational speaking. It's 80-20, right? So Diane multiple times would go, look, if I've got a solution where I think I'm 80% right, then I'm good. I'm ready to move, right? And the 20% of the time that it's wrong, that's what we'll deal with, right? So but I want to make the decision and move on, right? As opposed to trying to get to that 95, 97% answer. And again, it was the right team, the right place, at the right time, and we needed that philosophy to continue to progress. And so that was a huge strength that helped. It's just fun too. That helped the team a lot.
Fun and motivational speaker and fun goes.
And I don't mean to just kind of say that on the side. This was a stressful environment
Yeah.
for the team for months on end, and you needed to have that person that at the end of the day was like, "What are we doing?" Right? Whether we were on travel or whether we were here, because you needed the break. The team needed to relax.
So when there's a lot of pressure.
Ann and I did not
problems,
bring
then
that. Diane brought that to the management team, right?
Okay.
And it was important.
Bringing different things to the team as well. Do you both miss the research and technical work, since usually managers don't have time? So you're both more in a management role right now. Do you miss the research and technical side of things?
I really don't.
You said that in the opening.
Really like, I'm a whiz with PowerPoint and Excel and I like people and managing the team, and so but the actual technical.
You just need to be more outgoing.
There are certainly days where I look back and go, it was nice to walk in and I'd lay out my plan for what I was going to do in the lab for the day and then go home in the evening really satisfied. But I teach part-time now, so that's how I get my pretend play with the technical side. No, but I love, I will say right up front, it won't surprise anyone, I love it when we get one of our technical leads that wants to come in and tell me about what they're doing, right? And to live vicariously through that lead. So there are times, sure, when I miss it. And generally, though, it's still very satisfying to essentially be the person that's integrating it. Yeah.
In the mission and the technical, and perhaps part of it is more drill because you can kind of steer.
Yeah, and so it gets back to that, trying to help them understand how they fit into that next level up system, right? That's our job now.
Yeah. So. And you need to be able to understand enough of it.
Yeah.
To point them in the right direction.
Yeah. And this is a question that goes back to the mentoring one. But how do you go about mentoring others, and what are some of the key methods or approaches you use? So do you mentor other people, and how do you approach that?
Well, I don't know if they consider me to be their mentor, but I had a young engineer who wanted to get into project management, Dave Irames. He's actually now the project manager for Connect now. But way back before Connect, he just understood. He could see the big picture. He was in the research organization, and I just gave him more and more responsibility and more programmatic kinds of things. And he, stepped up so that by the time I was ready, and he was wanting to come over into CODEM, into spaceflight systems, he had already been doing the job to a large extent. And so I think that's a way to grow people is into project management, is to just, they don't have to have the title, they don't have to be in your organization, you can just delegate.
Work with them and give them work and get them in that path.
Yep.
That's worked for you. What about you?
Yeah, so I think when you encounter someone on a project team or in an organization that you see that little glimmer that either you recognize because that you think, oh, I was there, or even just, again, for me, it's a lot about that person seems to be thinking at a level or two up.
Right.
Right. And I'd like to interact with them to help them see at least how I think that those levels are interacting with them. Those I look at, those are the easy mentoring opportunities. And again, even if they're not formalized, having those interactions because they kind of naturally occur. It's the ones where, as a supervisor, if I have employees and I don't feel like I have that natural ability to sync with them and go, here's things to think about, to be more deliberate about it, I don't do that as well as I should, right? In terms of being deliberate with somebody, and we kind of make fun of it sometimes, but the development plan for someone just looking forward about what is it you want to go to next, and helping them think about what's next, right? Not at the expense of what they're doing now, but because to be better at planning and how do you want your career to move forward. I need to be better at that, but I think those opportunities are harder for me, more of a challenge.
So it sounded a few things. One is you try to give a larger perspective based on what you're doing, and also you try to keep one foot maybe in terms of what they currently have to do, but also keeping an eye on where do you want to go. Is that accurate? Want to talk, so you've been involved obviously in a lot of, complex missions and missions that cut across a lot of boundaries. And from the standpoint of sharing knowledge and learning lessons, one of the things, if it's tough within a team, it's even going to be more difficult as you go across centers or if you go to international partners. What are some of the approaches that you use to share knowledge or to share lessons across the larger team that you work with?
Well, Connect had a myriad of lessons, and I was the project manager at the time that it flew. And, and it was this grand success, and it powered up, and we're all, so excited, and, in the Telescience Support Center. Not too long after that, I was asked to do a lessons learned by headquarters. Please go all the way back. Right. And it's kind of a walk down memory lane, maybe a little bit reliving a nightmare. I don't know, but I did that, and we did a massive lessons learned where we collected them and sorted through them and grouped them and synthesized them and picked some to go into the agency database, and so that was my opportunity, and I pitched it to headquarters, this big, long, because they had some lessons that they could learn along the way too, not just the implementing center. Right. So that was very satisfying, we'll say. And I have this really great PowerPoint presentation. Yeah. That's my strong suit.
So partly going back in terms of seeing what happened.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the I think Connect did lessons learned well. I mentioned this earlier, and part of the reason is we were selfish, because we were being approached about lessons learned, because when it started to look like, oh, you're not going to fail, although there are good lessons learned from failures too, right? But oh, can you make sure you're documenting what you're doing? So we had some requirements to do that, and so we decided, all right, we're going to have to do this. We're going to make use of it for us right now. So at the team level, once we had the payload developed and assembled, then we had to go through system testing, right? So thermal vac and vibe and acoustics, or vibe and EMI. And so after each one of those major tests, we did, you'd almost call it pause and learn, right? But we did a stand down with the test team, and we brought in key members of the test team that was about to take the payload over. And we sat down for 2-3 hours, and we would go, what worked, what didn't. And by the time we got around to that third system level test, things like, well, here's how we do the pre-test checkout, and here's how we go through, and here's how we do that was all really polished and went really well because we'd done those intermediate lessons learned, pause and learn, whatever you want to call it.
You're doing it throughout. After testing.
And because we wanted to take advantage of our own lessons learned, right, as a project,
as opposed to just,
as opposed to just, oh, well, now we're done now and let someone else go do it. So within the team, at the team level, I think that helped a lot. I mean, it was really useful.
And our schedule was so compressed that you couldn't just have one team do Vibe and then the next, you know, the same team move on to thermal vac and the same team. No, these were, it was so tight that you had a team for Vibe and you had a team for thermal vac and you had a different, you know, set of people.
Because you're working
for
preps
EMI.
in parallel while the other person's in test.
So it's just as soon as that payload comes out, boom, it's in the next chamber.
Right.
So it became very important to impart that knowledge, you know, to the next folks that are going to take over the flight system.
At a larger level, like cross centers, cross agency, what I've found to be helpful and almost key is I just think that sometimes our systems for transfer don't work as well as individual people. Right. So honestly, one of the things that the whole agency was struggling with, right, and I referenced before, was 7120, 7123, the implementation. What do we do? What's the right level of rigor for different types of projects? And so I was in the chief engineer office here at Glenn when we were going through that while I was on Connect. But we had a person here from Langley who was on a detail, right, as part of a development program, and had just experienced Langley going through and talking about what do we do for the research projects and what do we do. And that individual point of contact, which led to a larger exchange, but it was that individual recognizing that we've done this and you guys are wrestling with it. That's what started it, right? And so in other situations too, I think if you've got that individual that wants to try to make the effort to start the interaction, then I think, yeah, we follow pretty well. But when we say we're going to have an agency-wide lessons learned, and is that always as effective as it could be? Not without the individuals, right? So once it's there and you know you can reference it and that individual sparks it, great. But it's hard sometimes from the top down.
Right. So obviously there are data systems and there are tools, but clearly both of you emphasize throughout it's the relationships and it's talking and it's linking it to the actual projects. The fact that you're doing it after a test where folks are coming together and talking about, or the fact that you're able to look back on successes and maybe some nightmares of how you learn from that. So it's the human connection.
Yeah.
One of the questions that we received is, how do you continue to learn? So one of the things that I've seen in my career is people, sometimes they get to a point where they get to an executive or senior position and they feel that they're there now, and now learning is for others. How do you go about trying to make sure that you're still learning, still?
I just think there are so many different jobs, and I do a job or a project for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years maybe, I think, at the most, and then you move on to the next project, and there's always something to learn. I'm continually amazed at how much I don't know, So I think that's the best thing. Move on. Move,
so
don't stay.
New
assignments.
New work.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of projects, is that they are all coming and going, and that just lends itself to being to move over. And we here at Glenn are organized by mission directorate, the branches more or less, or by program at headquarters. And so for us, it's actually pretty easy to move to the different branches because it's all project management and we are not the technical experts, so it doesn't matter if I'm working in Science Mission Directorate or HEO or Space Common Nav. I can be a project manager anywhere. And so I've moved around a fair amount. I'm starting to think I can't hold a job or something, but I've seen so many different styles even within Code M. And I think that's how I learn, as I'm learning from other people.
So learning for you is different assignments, rotations,
and different branches,
different hands-on, different people. Right. What about you, Mike?
Well, I think the first thing is that you can't ever think that you know it all. I mean, that just doesn't work, right? So in terms of how to motivate myself, it's those challenges, but things that I find interesting. And so the moving around helps a lot. It's a way to do that, right? So part of it might also be a certain measure of effectiveness. For me anyway, I get to a point where it's like I feel like I need to do something different. And that's usually a flag for me that, I might be getting too entrenched or too ingrained in something.
Too comfortable, and you want to do something different.
You need to try to do something different. So
I think we inherently, like a challenge. And so at some point you've mastered your job, your project, or whatever, and it's no longer as challenging. So
And
time to look for something
you know,
new.
we're people. You have to be honest about it. You get tired doing certain things, right? At some point, it's like, yeah, it's not necessarily that there aren't still challenges or still things to learn, but you're not taking in as much because you might get bored with what you're doing, or it's like, yeah, this just feels like the same thing over and over. Time for something different. Yeah.
See, your interest, you'll be aware, right? You don't have to do anything to figure it out if you're, because some people, they're maybe not sure. Maybe I'm in, maybe I'm not, but you're kind of open to the fact that there may be times to do something different.
I think, so several times through my career, right, there literally have been times where I can't wait to get in because we've got this thing we're working on and it is really cool, it's really exciting. And so when there are days when it's not like that, I find myself consciously aware of it. Okay. You know, that yeah, this could be different right now, maybe it's time to look for something else. But I just think that whole approach, the approach to a lifelong learning type plan, fortunately it's really easy at NASA. Right? There are so many brilliant people around with so many interesting things to do that we're really blessed that we have the opportunities to be able to move around and do those new and challenging things. Right? And not everybody has that. So that's another one to just kind of remind yourself when you're driving in, yeah, this is a really cool place to work. So.
Yeah.
And obviously the
I
service
think,
makes that
I
easy
think sometimes people forget how,
you can.
you know, we're NASA. That's cool. You know, that, yeah, we're not perfect, but we do really interesting work, and we do stuff no one else does. Yeah. So I think that's great.
Should be able to stay interested, right? Another question we have here is, what's the greatest influence that helped refine your project management skills? And this is directed at Diane, but for both of you, what was the greatest influence that helped you refine your project management or your leadership skills? Talked a lot about mentoring. Is there anything else that, any good training programs you've taken, or
no? I mean, I
courses
think
from APPEL or knowledge forums, or
yes, that is.
All right, kept that. Yeah. Thank you. No.
The greatest influence on my project management style.
What makes you an effective manager?
I think I've learned to trust my instincts. Okay. You know, I've made some mistakes along the way, no question about it, but I've learned from them, I hope. And I think with each successive project management job, it has been bigger and more expensive, or more, you know, more complex or higher visibility, and I've succeeded. And so at some point you're like, yeah, you know what, I can do this. I know how to do this.
The experience
and
of
you
the doing.
you have this, you know, a confidence that you know how to do this. If you don't know what you're doing, there are a million people here who are happy to tell you and give you some help and to listen to them. And so I think that it's really evolved over time with, you know, I've been lucky. Honestly, I've never plotted out my career. I always
So don't plan, you're telling people.
But that worked for me. But that
NASA
doesn't mean, you know, that works for everybody. But that I'm comfortable with that, you know, and I actually never had to go look.
You described you're very hands-on, taking on different and learning from that.
Yeah.
Anything? How do you become more effective leader?
So I think for me, it's a combination. Training is valuable. There's no question, right? I mean, and particularly for someone that comes up through a research or an engineering side, and when you start getting exposed to project management, it's key to get plugged in with a good project manager, right? And then, but the training certainly helps, right, in terms of formal. But it's the training and the experience, because that also allows you to sit in that classroom and go, okay, I understand that's what the book says. This is how I've seen somebody use something similar. Right, so you get more out of the training as long as you've got relevant experience, right, to draw from also. But I just want to touch on, it's easier for me because she's leading with most of the answers, so I can build on them. That thing about getting the confidence about, yeah, I can do this, right? I can think of several points in my career where I went home in the evening, I'm sitting on the couch at 2 a.m., right, going, I don't know if I can do this, right? And after you get those first couple, where it's like, yeah, it worked out, then they're there to draw on, right? And you go, no. I felt this way before, but it still worked out, right? So having the ability to have those small successes so that when you get the bigger challenges, right, you've got something, I can do this. I know it's hard, but I can do it. That's huge. So giving people those opportunities to have those small successes, right, early in their project management career is key. It's important. They need to have that.
We We have a question here that gets into the broader, knowledge sharing, knowledge capture, and summarize it in your division. How do you go about capturing knowledge from experienced, close to retirement employees? I mean, is that a priority to capture, lessons from, I guess, more sure experienced folks? And how do you go about transferring some of that to younger employees? So in general, is there a strategy in your organization for seeking, wisdom from folks who may be leaving and carrying that with them and getting it to young professionals?
I'll try this one first.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So the answer is yes, and we have the discussions deliberately about, particularly for key project manager roles, folks that we think might be close to retirement. What are we going to do, right, when that person actually walks out the door? And there's lots of different strategies. In my opinion, the best strategy is having enough advance notice that an event like that might be happening in the future, and having the resources to put a more junior project manager along with that person to be the heir apparent, right, to move in and say, yes, they're going to try to capture what have you done well, what didn't work and why, but we don't always have the ability to do that resource-wise, right? But when you can, I think that what I've seen, that works best. There's other stuff in terms of documenting exit interviews, trying to have the person, something as simple as, do we have all of the history of the projects that you've done, and is it archived well, right? That kind of thing. That's all helpful. But again, I keep getting back to the personal interaction. Yep. That's where you get those stories that I talked about before, right? And that's face-to-face time. So if we don't give that person face-to-face time with more junior people in the organization, it's not as effective.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There's, I think opportunities, the more opportunities you have for those informal discussions with senior people and more junior, and just a mix of project managers, because we are kind of isolated. And even though we're in the same branch, maybe you're the only one working on your project.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so to share that knowledge, I do feel like it works best in an informal situation, talking about war stories or complaining about something that, didn't go your way, and someone else saying, oh yeah, that happened to me, and this is what I did. And so we try to foster that within our organization.
Creating access for your people to
Right.
talk to you and to talk amongst each
Right.
other.
And a key part of that is having a safe environment to do it.
Right.
I want those senior project managers to talk about what didn't work, right? Oh boy, did I screw this up? I mean, that kind of stuff, right? If we can't talk about it that way, you lose, right? The ability to learn from it.
And that's having an environment of trust where
You
people
bet.
can talk about anything and share and exchange.
Yeah.
I was given kind of a sign that we have about 5 minutes, so I thought we were going to talk for 2 hours. But, so let me go through a couple of others. This one was directed at Mike, pertaining to Connect, but both of you can probably, well, this is really from, as the engineering technical authority, what was the greatest conflict or disagreement you had with project management, and how did you resolve it? So.
Well, Dave,
Says here, this is Dave, don't let him know
I am incredible. One of the things I'm most proud of on Connect, yes, I was chief engineer for 28 months. Something like that. I know I made it up right now, so it may not be accurate, but it's quite close. Anyway, we went through some crazy discussions. I never once had to play the tech authority card. So I would go through, we would have an ERB, either Ann or Diane would sit in my ERB so that the project was there. They were not assertive. They were, they sat and they listened, so it wasn't inappropriate as a project manager. We had the big discussion, and then I would hand over a recommendation to them, and whether it was a formal PRB or whether it was a discussion in the hallway, we would work out a solution where I did not have to go, I got to play the tech authority card, I want to take it up a level. And we had some real serious resource constraints and schedule constraints, but I believe it was the three of us trusting each other that, look, we're trying to get something that works. And every time I brought them data to say, this is why I think this is a threat, or this is why we need to go get this information, they were reasonable and received it. And so even though we had very challenging discussions sometimes, and people could hear the two of us down the hall, it never turned into a tech authority issue, right? So I think it was just that common.
You're able to work with the team.
We're trying to
in an
succeed,
effective way.
right? We want to do what's right for the team, and so we never had. I
The
never had.
relationships were there, and
bet.
obviously you built that. Not that much time, but to me, it's an important thing. Both of you are involved in a lot of innovative kind of missions and technologies, and this. How do you balance the ability to be innovative, which is usually pushing kind of boundaries, going in different directions, but also the risk management of trying to, minimize failure?
Well, I'm in my program now is Advanced Exploration Systems, and at the headquarters level, Jason Cruzan is very open and says, look, I don't want everybody to be successful. If everybody is always successful, we are not taking enough risk. And so to hear that message from the top down really helps, and at each level, and be comfortable. I think that you, as a project manager, can convey that, further down, into the team that it's okay if it doesn't work out. I'm 80-20. We'll figure if it's wrong, we'll figure it out and we'll do something else. And so I think that as a project manager, you have to be comfortable taking risks and be comfortable being wrong. Yeah. I am okay being wrong. Yeah. So I think that's a good way to balance
with
it.
Trying things out. It's okay to, in certain cases, okay to fail.
Absolutely. So
being clear on that.
My dad taught me a couple of things, that always stick with me. And the one is, you can't win with scared money. So he liked to go to Vegas, and he liked to, and if you're afraid to double down when you're supposed to double down, or you're afraid to split, aces and eights because it puts out twice as much money, you are not going to win. So I say you can't win with scared money. So take the risk, and most of the time it's going to have a payoff. And the few times that it doesn't, that's the cost of doing business.
It's too bad we don't have more time for that one. I would just say, what I see too often is people that come in and say innovation and risk management are mutually exclusive, and they're not. So if you try to go into a project, and when you want to talk about risk management, if the first thing somebody does is says, here's the database we want to use, that's a key. Stop. And I'll say right up front, I've made that mistake, right? Where that's how we started the discussion. Step back, talk about the philosophy. Why are we doing what we're doing? What's the point? The point is to help us be successful, regardless of what level of risk we're going to accept, right? And so having that conversation up front with the key players and the folks that are going to do it, I think is important. But the main thing is that, look, we manage risk on every project that we run, whether it's research or whether it's a flight project. It's just a different, right, set of acceptable risks or a different level of risk that we take overall. They're not mutually exclusive. You do risk management on everything that we do.
Right. And final question I have for both of you. I mean, you both have had successful careers by everything today. It seems like you've enjoyed, and you're still enjoying what you're doing. Yeah. What advice would you give for someone who's just starting out at NASA or in aerospace or any place? What is the secret to getting to this point and enjoying? Is there something you'd recommend?
I say, find the fun.
Find the fun.
We're NASA. There's fun to be had. Find the fun, find the people that you enjoy, and make the best of it. That you make of your career and of your experience or your project, whatever you want to make of it. And there is fun to be had, and go find the fun.
Find the fun, and don't worry about scared money or something like that. Yeah,
you can't win with scared money.
You can't win with scared money.
If it's someone that's coming in, especially fresh out, new person in the agency, absolutely. There are so many good opportunities, right? So don't be afraid to try to find the opportunities and to move around. And honestly, I would look for someone when you sit down and you have the interview, you're interviewing that potential employer too, that new project manager, that new branch chief that you may want to go work for, and look for somebody that encourages you to be daring, right? That is not going to be worried about failure, right? Yes, recognize that you're going to have mistakes, you're going to have some whoppers. It's okay, right? So I'd look for that kind of a relationship, that kind of opportunity. But have fun, for sure.
Have fun and keep learning and take the risks.
Don't be afraid to take a challenge. That's you'll figure it out. They'll figure it out. They'll be successful. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank Diane and Mike for taking the time. I don't think it was a nightmare or anything.
Nope.
Got a lot of excellent lessons from both of you. I want to thank the Glenn Research Center for organizing this, particularly the Chief Knowledge Officer, Martin Forkosh, for setting it up, and Kathy Clark from Human Capital Development, and the crew here that's set up a beautiful environment that really is wonderful. So thank you, and keep learning.